Hello. Is everyone sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin. I wanted to look at Abraham Maslow because he's someone that I was very fond of as an undergraduate when I was studying psychology. Maslow was an all too brief sort of pit stop when we were looking for history and philosophy of psychology, and I saw this sort of smiling grandparent textbook, and he reminded me a little bit of the sort of laughing Taoist immortals. I don't know if you've ever seen the Taoist immortals. They're often, although quite sort of aged in this picture, there's sort of a timeless, youthful quality to it. And I was preparing myself for this paper by watching some of the footage. There's not much footage available of him talking about his life and his experiences. But he did sort of really communicate a sense of ease and contentment towards those last, and unfortunately cut rather short in his last few years of his life and research. So I suppose what this isn't about is this pyramid. Okay? Enough already with the pyramid. And it's still used a lot. It's gone beyond psychology. It's used in tourism studies, it's used in management, in business, in nursing, and education. And I suppose, as with any theory, does it survive the test of time? Or as you see the pyramids closer up, you realise that it's actually not these smooth lines, it's getting a little bit worn and crumbly, and people are critiquing and deconstructing the theory as it goes. But what I'm more interested in is the bit atop the pyramid. Those last years when he's really starting to move beyond and speak about transcendence and self-transcendence as opposed to just self-actualization, or Z theory, or probably Z theory in the States. So I was interested in why isn't transcendence mentioned in most of the undergraduate textbooks when we talk about Maslow? It usually culminates in self-actualization. It's rarely mentioned and seems to culminate and conclude in self-actualization. Mainstream psychology seemingly had or has little use, time or interest in transcendence. Reading Maslow's later works in some detail, I noticed a common thread, and that seems to be an abiding interest, almost an obsession in his later writings with transcendence, but also the scientific method. And these two topics are very much deeply interwoven, and I've argued in my paper that the thread that appears to join the two is Taoism. And in his later works, 66, The Psychology of Science, and 71, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, there are more references to Taoism than any other wisdom tradition. It's certainly more than Buddhism or Judaism. You might expect Maslow's Jewish background, and some of that might have filtered through, but not in any sort of obvious, immediate sense. But I think it's important to recognise that he refers to it as Taoistic, and perhaps I'll leave that open as to why he does, and I've got my own ideas as to why he does that. So, what is it about Taoism or the Taoistic that Maslow thought was crucial or central to psychology and also science? That's part of what I'd like to talk about. Well, he certainly sees it as being hugely important. In The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, he argues, clearly we as scientists, not to mention physicians, teachers, or even parents, must shift our image over to a more Taoistic one. This is the one word that I can think of that summarizes succinctly the many elements of the image of a more humanistic scientist. Taoistic means asking rather than telling. It means non-intruding, non-controlling. It stresses non-interfering observation rather than a controlling manipulation. It is receptive and passive rather than active and forceful. This brings me to the question of science and what kind of science it is that we do, or what kind of scientist we are. I love the title of the subtitle of this conference, The Science and the Art, and this is something that I'm constantly struggling with in the sense of discomfort, but sort of enjoying the dialogue between art and science, and asking myself, what kind of scientist am I? Recently, through the BPS, became a chartered scientist, and it made me interrogate, what kind of scientist am I? I'm certainly not the lab coat wearing scientist, and the psychology that our students do isn't in laboratories. I often say the laboratory is outside, it's in the streets of Leeds. It's sort of the outer space and the inner space that we're sort of interested in. That's the laboratory. And the tendency to distinguish, to differentiate, to create a sort of dichotomy between the soft sciences and the hard sciences. And I suppose also the perhaps unspoken tendency, proudly articulated in some sections, that we do a hard science here. This is hard science, this is the tough stuff, this is the objective, cold, dispassionate way of experimentation. And what struck me when I started thinking about hard and soft was to turn to the Taoistic, or the Taoism, specifically the Tao Te Ching. Something that I gently nudge Maslow for not doing in my paper is he's pretty lazy when it comes to referencing. So it gives you a sense that he understands Taoism, that he's been reading Taoist scriptures, but he doesn't say this is from the Tao Te Ching, or this is from Zhuangzi, or this is from this particular scripture, or that particular scripture. Carl Rogers was much better in that respect. He did say this from the Tao Te Ching, and certainly Martin Buber, who both Rogers and Maslow owe a great debt of gratitude towards. He was also very much sort of referencing Zhuangzi, particularly. He helped translate Zhuangzi and popularize these ideas. So I was thinking of hard and soft science, and I thought of this verse from the Tao Te Ching. A man is born gentle and weak, and at his death he is hard and stiff. Green plants are tender and filled with sap. At their death they are withered and dry. Therefore the stiff and unbending is the disciple of death. The gentle and yielding, twice. The disciple, is that a Freudian? Is the disciple of life, not death. Thus an army without flexibility never wins a battle. A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The hard and strong will fall, the soft and weak will overcome. And this made me think in terms of what kind of science, transpersonal psychology, should aim to be. It was interesting as well, in the original programme I was going to be speaking around the same time as Rupert Sheldrake, and I thought this was very interesting as well, to have this sort of conversation about science and its relative hardness or softness. Well, Maslow's very keen to emphasise that Eastern writers have stressed more the concept of the observer's harmony with the nature that he or she studies. I don't want to get into a life of Brian. Or she. Here, the stress is a little different, for it's implied that the observer is himself, or herself. Audience participation is part of the nature he observes. He fits in, he belongs, he is at home, he is part of the scene rather than a spectator of a diorama. In a sense, he studies his mother while he's in his mother's arms. That's very beautiful, very poetic. And I wouldn't say it is, it does sound very Taoist, and it's quite a contrast, I'm sure you'll agree, from the celebrated, neutral, dispassionate, cold observer. The idea of being objective, and what that means. And it reminded me a lot of someone whose name I mispronounced horrendously on so many occasions. It's actually Cohen, the sort of famous scholar of Taoism, who taught me how to pronounce, hope I get it right because it's on tape now, Goethe. Is that fair enough? Yes. Not Goethe, okay. Or Goethe, or no, it's definitely Goethe. The idea of Goethean science. Now, Maslow doesn't reference Goethe, and many transpersonal psychologists also don't tend to remember or recognize or reference his work. I think this is something something that needs to be sort of addressed or sort of repaired. As transpersonal psychologists, sometimes we don't recognize the debt we owe to Goethe or to Steiner as well. But Maslow's wish that scientists become receptive contemplators, lamenting the desacralizing of science, his emphasis that the love of the subject being studied as opposed to the object. It's interesting, something that Maslow and I have in common is our mutual love of primates and monkeys. He actually began a lot of his research studying monkeys, and I also, interested in psychology, was sort of almost that comparative psychology. I spent a lot of time at places like Dorset, Monkey World, and Monkey Forest in Manchester watching these. And it was not in the sort of clinical experience, it was a genuine love and fascination with these creatures. So the love of the subject being studied as opposed to the object, which he refers to as love knowledge or Taoist objectivity. And it does sound remarkably similar to Goethe's earlier critiques. I'm thinking particularly here of Isaac Newton and his theory of light, to which Goethe famously referred to it or dismissed it or critiqued it as being the mere skeleton of light, that he'd stripped from it that which was human, the sort of the experiential, relational aspects of light, the meaning aspects of light, the qualia, the qualia, which he preferred to say. So it did remind me of these sort of earlier critiques, and that perhaps we might use sort of Taoistic or Goethean almost interchangeably. Another important aspect that Goethe seems to share with Maslow is the importance, the centrality of intuition, of recognizing, of celebrating, of including intuition. And again, another quote from the Tao Te Ching, the 5 colors blind the eye, the 5 tones deafen the ear, the 5 flavors dull the taste, racing and hunting madden the mind, precious things lead one astray. Therefore the sage is guided by what she feels and not by what he sees. He lets go of that and chooses this. I should point out that all these translations are done by Jia Feng, who most of you probably have heard of the Esalen Institute. Jia Feng used to sort of do sessions there, but he also used to look at, there's like hot springs there, and he used to sort of look after the hot springs. And it was while he was looking after the hot springs that Abraham Maslow and his wife came to use them. And Jia Feng, the translator, actually had one of Maslow's transcripts that he got him to sign. And I often wonder how much they spoke, and to what extent Jia Feng might be responsible for some of Maslow's interest in Taoism. Also, there's the Alan Watts connection, who Jia Feng spent a lot of time with and actually helped translate. And as you'll be aware, there's lots of different translations of the Tao Te Ching. There's many, many competing translations. The reason I've chosen Jia Feng's is because he's one of the inspirations behind one of the few British-born Taoist priests, Xi Jing, in this country, the British Taoist Association. He was one of his first teachers. And also because he sort of was very much in his childhood, one of his educators, one of his tutors was from the famous Hanlin Academy, which was the best academy where you could learn and specialised in the Chinese classics. So I tend to treat his translations as being very sort of authoritative, but also very much informed by humanistic and transpersonal psychology as well. Now, Maslow doesn't use this term, but this is clearly what he's talking about, the idea of Wu Wei and Zuran. And I think this quote relates quite nicely to the other quote. If you think of the idea of the pursuit of knowledge, of science being a cumulative process or trying to work towards some grand unified theory, then it would seem that sort of Taoism is somewhat at odds, or a Taoistic approach would be somewhat at odds with this. It says that in the pursuit of learning every day something is acquired, but in the pursuit of Tao every day something is dropped. Less and less is done until non-action, and this is what they translated Wu Wei as meaning, but I've got an alternative translation I'll share with you shortly. When nothing is done, nothing is left undone. The world is ruled by letting things take their course. It cannot be ruled by interfering. So this is what Maslow is referring to by this non-controlling. It's only frustrating that he doesn't sort of relate it to these chapters in the Tao Te Ching. But as I'm going to argue soon, he did sort of really, I think, have a good grasp on Taoist scripture. And this idea of Ziran as well, which translates sometimes as spontaneity, naturalness. So these two terms being very much related. So I mentioned before this idea of Taoistic listening and what this involves. And it's a bit of an interesting quote or example that Maslow uses. He uses the example of cutting a turkey. I've put little instructions there. Sorry to all the vegetarians or vegans. You know, he's talking about this sort of Taoistic listening. How do you do it? This looks a bit like sort of turkey. It's made easier by knowledge of where the joints are, how to handle the knife and fork. That is by possessing full knowledge of the situation. I thought it's a bit of a strange example to jump into, carving a turkey. But then it suddenly occurred to me where it came from. It comes from the Zhuangzi, although he hasn't referenced it. I'm almost positive it comes from the Zhuangzi, because in the Zhuangzi we have the story of Cook Ting, who effortlessly surveys the ox before him and chops it up with the cleaver, and his knife seems to never to dull. We hear the story here when the king or the prince asks him, how has he managed to reach this level of mastery? He replies, what your servant really cares for is the Tao, the way, which goes beyond mere art. When I first began to cut up oxen, I saw nothing but oxen. After 3 years of practicing, I no longer saw the ox as a whole. I now work with my spirit. The term there is Shen, if you're interested. It's S-H-E-N, spirit. I now work with my spirit, not with my eyes. My senses stop functioning, and my spirit takes over. I follow the natural brain, letting the knife find its way through the many hidden openings, taking advantage of what is there, never touching a ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. Now, what's sort of interesting me from here, from the scholarship point of view, is tracing these sources and finding out where this comes from, and recognising that Maslow, I think, had a much deeper understanding, or read far deeper into Taoism than some people who criticise him and say when he writes about religion he doesn't really have an in-depth understanding. I think when it came to Taoism he had looked at it sort of very closely. Well, we can see that Maslow is bringing in Taoism as an additional method, an additional approach, really. It's not as an alternative to the scientific method. It's more a supplement, as integral theorists might say. It's there to supplement the scientific method. And it was drawn to my attention by some colleagues who are sinologists and interested in Taoist studies, that around the same time, Joseph Needham, Professor Joseph Needham, was sort of also looking at the role Taoism played and contributed to Chinese science and civilization. We have his massive encyclopedia. I was going to sort of buy it to sort of prepare this paper, and I realised there were many, many volumes, and each one was many hundreds of pounds, and decided instead to speak to people who had read it or who had access to it in libraries, and particularly the work of Sivin was very, very useful. And the work of Michael Stanley Baker, who helped direct me to this work. And Sivin's saying that when Needham is writing about Taoists, he's kind of romanticizing them from a more materialistic perspective. He's saying that Taoists are, in the work of Needham, Taoists are presented as being agnostic naturalists, mechanists, materialists, experimentalists, empiricists who avoided preconceived ideas. While at the same time, for Needham, recognizing that Taoism lies at the basis of all subsequent Chinese scientific thought. I thought I wanted to include this because it shows that they're both kind of using Taoism to different ends. One is sort of showing the ancient, almost proto-science roots of Taoism, and the other is almost using Taoism to remedy a rather reductionist, materialist take on science, and particularly in psychology. So I thought it was useful to include this because they were both working around the same time. Neither seems aware of the other's work or the ends to which they're using Taoism. And something that I've written about quite a lot over the last few years is what I refer to as the psychologization of Eastern traditions, particularly Buddhism. There's a paper called The Psychologization of Buddhism, which is freely available online. That was the annual review of critical psychology put out by the Discourse Unit at Manchester Metropolitan University, Physical University. And also some work I've done on the psychologization of Taoism, which looks at similar themes, the way that we sometimes as psychologists, we sort of cherry pick the bits that look psychologically interesting and then just declare the rest of the fields fallow. Which can sometimes be a mischaracterization or misrepresentation of the traditions. And something I've spent a fair amount of time doing when I go to conferences in China, I usually make the argument that if you're going to have a dialogue with psychology, it's best to speak to transpersonal psychologists because they're usually more spiritually sensitive and literate, and often practitioners in a particular tradition themselves, and they're not going to try and misrepresent the tradition. You'll notice when you read Maslow's later work, actually, that the term transpersonal occurs rarely if at all. And it struck me, or occurred to me, that we might have ended up with the term Taoistic as opposed to transpersonal. And it would be very interesting if this was the sort of Taoistic section of the British Psychological Society. Would that have made sort of any difference if we followed Maslow's trail of thought, and would we be using Lao-Tzu on his oxen, not the one that put tin chopped up obviously, as opposed to the Vitruvian man with all its connotations of Renaissance and the sort of sacred symmetry and harmony between mind, body, spirit. And then I was looking at what Maslow had written about what he seemed as needing to happen in psychology, and it sort of seems very clear that his ambitions have largely been realised. And I was looking at sort of Broad and Anderson's work. I sort of was looking at this as an undergraduate against the advice of the people supervising my undergraduate work, who said, just stick to SPSS. And we can see that, you know, in the original 98 publication, there's realization, the hopes, the expansion of the scientific method, the transformation of psychology into a more humane, spiritually literate discipline. And quite early in the book, we can see this advanced form of integral inquiry that's almost identical to when Maslow is talking about, I refer to it there as the completion stage of interpersonal knowledge and mystical fusion, Maslow's own terms. It's mystical fusion where the object becomes the subject, and even more so becomes sort of drawn into the experiencer. So he talks about emotional, intuitive and non-verbal expressive aspects can be added in greater density to research projects to make them more complete, more balanced, and more likely to tap all dimensions of what is being studied. But a researcher can take an even bolder step as well in the direction of what is a truly transpersonal methodology. Such a step involves paying full attention to what is known directly by the eye of the spirit. Again, think back to that quote of Shem, that Taoistic listening, that Taoistic objectivity. The eye of the spirit. This type of knowing seems to require a change or transformation in the investigator's being. It requires that the investigator become what is being studied and to know it as subject rather than object. This reminds me of certain techniques in Chinese painting, sort of watercolours, particularly the artists that do bamboo and say, you become bamboo and then you can effortlessly sort of paint it. But this is another important distinction that I'd like to make, the idea of wu wei meaning simply non-action or non-interfering. You'll notice the artist sort of studies for a long time to become bamboo. So usually when I've tried to translate wu wei, I've translated it as effortless, simply because effort is required initially. So effortless, you need to undergo a process of training or cultivation. Certainly in the Taoist tradition, there's a big contrast between the, armchair Taoist, someone that might still describe himself as a philosophical Taoist.
A nightstand Taoist.
Yeah, who's read the Tao of Pooh, which I love, I still really like that. And that's their idea of wu wei is essentially just sitting on the couch and not doing. This is complete contrast. If you go to China and meet Taoists, they are engaged in cultivation practices, and it's a lot of work before it becomes effortless. Similarly in the martial arts, similarly in music, in dance, that effortlessness belies, or it hides many years, decades, if you believe in the Taoist concept of immortality, centuries of practice. Again, the way to be and the how to do. Maslow provides rather scant details on how to cultivate these states. I was having a conversation with Steve Taylor, who sends you all his warm regards, couldn't be here today. And we had one of the first consciousness studies lecture on our undergraduate program, and someone was taking Maslow to task for being a little bit, sort of, I suppose, hierarchical and a little bit sort of nondescript in how to attain some of these states or how to get a peak experience. It seems a little bit haphazard. And who becomes self-actualized, and what are the methods used in order to become self-actualized or have an experience of transcendence? It doesn't seem particularly well spelled out. But one of the things that towards the end of his life he does start to introduce exercises, particularly at the Esalen Institute. But Maslow does provide rather scant details on how to cultivate these qualities. He talks about Taoistic listening, but he doesn't really say how do you listen in this way? What sort of practices, what meditations, how do you prepare the ground? Whereas we see, particularly in the most up-to-date Anderson and Broad 2011, there is a wealth of experiential exercises included. How to do this throughout the body, designed to engage and enhance the researcher's empathic capacities and sensitivities, ranging from mindful attending to visualization, whilst also taking care not to neglect or exclude the body by including discussions on kinesthesia and the body-mind. While I'm here, I should probably point out, everyone's heard a lot about mindfulness over the last decade, and I always get a little bit frustrated that it's not more associated with transpersonal psychology and psychologists, as it's not simply to do with the alleviation of stress or depressive symptoms. It is about spiritual transformation. Anyway, that's another paper or another conference topic. At Leeds Metropolitan University, we've started teaching the module psychonautics or psychosomanautics, literally navigating the mind and the body. And I should sort of stress, I'll start with this qualification at the beginning. It is not intended as a replacement term for transpersonal psychology. It's just not. We were really just using it to describe the techniques or methods used to reach transpersonal states or stages. It was sort of an interesting term that myself and several colleagues were playing around with. And it really grew out of my study of Taoism, looking at the way Taoists would navigate the mind and navigate the body. And we'll give just one or two examples of what that might mean. And again, it differentiates itself from more mainstream approaches of psychology, sort of the Greek compound psychologia, the study of the mind, arguably more concerned with passive theoretical understandings, whereas we're more interested in active, experiential, embodied transformations. Many of our students got their first taste of meditation in our last session, and if nothing else, they learned how difficult it is to sit, which is, you know, the beginnings of body wisdom, and the way that sort of leads into studying the mind. I mentioned something. I suppose I was writing this quite late last night, and I don't know why I put the lotus. Oh yes, I remember why I put the lotus and the butterfly. I suppose both of them. Yes, I thought it was a nice title for a book, actually. The lotus and the butterfly. But I suppose one is a more typical Eastern symbol for the emergence of perhaps the self with a capital S, although Buddhists would find that problematic. I'm sure the non-self with a capital N. And this sort of the butterfly and that journey from chrysalis to, you know, both are almost identical symbols. Both emerge, in the case of the lotus flower, from the depths, that sort of journey sort of upwards, and only revealed becomes sort of manifest above the surface of the water, untainted and clean. Similarly, the butterfly, from this seemingly inert, dead state comes this, you know, you don't need to be an analytical psychologist to appreciate the sort of the depth and breadth of the meaning here. So yes, sort of through this idea of psychosomanortics and sort of navigating this mind and body, we come back full circle to Taoism, but I'd argue more to Taoism than the Taoistic. I was very interested in the Taoist emphasis on being an intimate part of our world. We are literally studying our mother while in her arms. The blending of the chi of heaven and earth is how the human being is understood. So what comprises us, the chi of heaven, I'm going to try and use the Chinese then, but I couldn't remember the tone, of heaven and earth. And it's beautifully represented in these diagrams. You can see here the neijing, wherever you see nei, it means inner in Chinese. And often it relates to alchemical practices, or the nei dan, for instance, the inner alchemy. So the neijing, two maps of the inner landscapes where the macrocosm within the microcosm is visually and graphically depicted. And I've described this as an artistic, imaginal, mythic illustration that the practitioner uses under guidance from the teacher, the shifu. And in it you can see these various constellations, natural features and celestial beings represented within the human body. If you're interested in researching this more deeply, you can read Skipper's classic, The Taoist Body. For fuller discussion, you can see Professor James Miller's fantastic Taoist ecology, and a more sort of summarised, humble contribution in the transpersonal review of Tao of environmental psychology. So again, this movement from Taoistic to Taoist, so transpersonal psychology through psychosomanortics, we recognise that these inner landscapes may be radically transformed through psychophysical, spiritual practice. And just taking this from our new handbook, that consciousness is the terrain that we are exploring, while simultaneously being the vehicle allowing us to explore and transform the terrain. So, in some of the work we're doing in psychonautics at Leeds Met, we're utilising and creatively adapting these techniques from Neidan, from inner alchemy, from these traditions, and it's hoped that as transpersonal psychologists we can include even more authentically Taoist experiential insights, in addition to Maslow's Taoistic modes of being. That's just a picture of, yes, that is me on the far left, with some of the sort of Taoist cultivators at Mount Wudang which was made famous in the old Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Sort of finished as well, so that's yes, I have. Excellent. So I'll turn it over. I've got plenty of time for questions. Questions or comments? Or we can have another silence.
Sorry, it's me again. It's interesting that you should mention the watercolour paintings, because while on a visit to New York to do some research, I went to the MoMA Gallery, and there was a painting there, a piece of calligraphy. And the calligrapher, the painting was the length probably of that wall, narrow but very long. And the calligrapher finished on the symbol. And then the line, the paintbrush line, dribbled down the page. And the transcript was that he'd lost consciousness. He'd gained consciousness, sorry. He gained consciousness from the loss of consciousness while he was writing about one of the emperors he was scripting. So the point that you were making was that watercolour painting has to be effortless.
Or any artistic technique at its highest level seems to reach this, what we might describe as this effortless, this wu wei. It becomes this natural expression, rather than the contrived effort that many of us,
and the conscious effort.
Yeah, so for instance, when I see people who've been lecturing for many years, for them it's effortless, they're calm, they don't perspire as much as I do. And it's just, they're there, they're solid, and it appears effortless. And similarly, when you see someone who's fantastically good at calligraphy, when I try Chinese calligraphy, my tongue suddenly sticks out down.
The watercolour paintings that you showed on your presentation, the type of watercolour paintings are not painted from life. They're taught by the teacher, and it can take 40, 50 years for the student to learn the lack of effort.
Yes, it's all technique.
Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you for your presentation. I found it very, very interesting. I mean, a lot of it was over my head, but nevertheless, I found it very interesting. I was trying actually to try to make a connection between transpersonal states, the Tao, and my practice, what I do when I do what I do. As a therapist, I feel that the best moments are when I manage to get out of the way, when I allow something else to take over. I think that something else is my intuition. I think that something else is forgetting what I know. Because I think that if you're in a room working with someone who, there isn't a place for three. I mean, it's either the patient and yourself, but if all of a sudden all your knowledge comes in, then the room becomes very crowded. It's actually very important to be able to allow the space, to allow the emptiness for something creative to develop. I usually, when I talk about assessment interviews, I call it just a psycho-sniff. And in this psycho-sniff, I am sniffing another human being and being sniffed by another human being. And I think this is important. There is an equality in a therapeutic relation. And actually, if one can move from a vertical perspective to a more horizontal perspective, then something happens that allows for a space. I don't know if that's Taoism or not, but I think it's a way.
What you're saying certainly resonates, it rings a lot of bells. And I think if you look at sort of this sort of client-centered ways of working, sort of humanistic and almost the Buberian sort of roots of some of this, and we move to this dialogical approach, that requires space for that to happen. I'm reminded of two things. One is in Carl Rogers' writings when he talks about one of his initially disastrous encounters where he eventually just says to the person, look, I can't help, should we reschedule, or maybe we should just both accept and be adults about this and walk away. And it's his honest admission in his retreat that sort of creates this space that allows the client to step in at that point and perhaps be more authentic. And I think authenticity is one of the key things that we're striving for as human beings in therapy. The term sort of is used in Taoism, some schools of Taoism, is Zhenren, literally authentic, real human being. Although, interestingly, from a Taoist perspective, the idea of the Zhenren, it's transcendent as opposed to just immanent. And this is something that I've been very interested in terms of the way Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism as well, particularly Vedanta, are sometimes used by psychologists. It's sometimes reminding psychologists and psychotherapists, and reminding myself as well, that these aren't simply a series of coping mechanisms to help us better adjust to life's sort of trials and traumas. These are powerfully transformative, sort of radical methods and measures. This is about spiritual transformation, which is again go back to this question of the way mindfulness is sometimes used or reduced often. It's very good that it's been used in this way. But again, I don't want to digress, coming back to your question of space, the other thing it sort of reminds me of is sort of Martin Buber's work in the idea of the dialogical, or dialogical, I don't know how people want to say that, and that real sense of deep listening. And again, that requires a space, and there's a lovely verse in the Tao Te Ching where it talks about space and emptiness, and it says it's, without the space in the glass, it's useless. It's the space of the room that makes it a room. We just had a whole session actually in environmental psychology where we spent a seminar debating the difference between space and place, and all got very dizzy and disorientated in the process. But I think that space is absolutely integral.
Just time for one last question.
Yeah, thank you. It strikes me that the two previous speakers, and also here the gentleman from Argentina, they bring up points which are much more universal than we. I mean, this is my interpretation, but that seem to be much more universal than we actually want to recognize. To experience Buddhism by just go sit on a mat or on a cushion. I mean, this is how the Benedictine monks say, don't ask how you do it, just do it, right? And that's how you learn. The not knowing, there is an English medieval work called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is the basic of all Christian meditation. I mean, these kind of things, therefore, I mean, I myself, I'm a particle physicist by education, so everything that you say is the scientist participates in the results just by the methods that they use. Sure. And so as a consequence, there seems to me and I recognize in what you say many things that I use and that and findings that I have that I will try and relate to them when I speak. But so there is this level of universality that we have not been looking at until now. That's the point that I want to say. I mean, that's what I recognize here in this little time so far.
It's treading a line, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I'm always very sensitive of doing is not overgeneralizing, and another thing I'm keen not to do is to sort of over-specialize. Something that transpersonal psychologists are often accused of is being generalists. You know, I love the work of Joseph Campbell, but one of the most common criticisms was it's a rather surface treatment of some of these traditions, but I still don't see any way of escaping these universals or similarities. The deeper I go into these traditions, the more in common they seem to have. Particularly at sort of these, sort of, if you like, these completion stages or these highest levels of attainment. There's Professor Michael Sasso, who's got a very sort of colourful lineage as both one time he's been a Jesuit priest, a Taoist priest, and a Buddhist priest. And he's written a book called Shaman Oracle, something Shaman Oracle Priest. It's got these terms in it, and in it he's looking at where all these traditions sort of unite. This is someone who's been deeply involved in each one of these traditions, and he recognises that at the apophatic level, that state of, sort of mystical dropping of labels, of terms, there is this union. There is this, if not a common language, then a common silence. And is it the same thing that we're all not talking about is perhaps an interesting question. But I think the universals are very important, so that we, you know, I'm still, despite all the critiques, at heart I'm still a perennialist. I think in terms of the idea of the perennial philosophy and a common source within human experience, and perhaps different cultural articulations. I haven't heard anything yet that would shake me from that conviction.